All right. Welcome back again, everyone. A familiar face showing up. Today, Maxwell Foxman, who presented yesterday and whose name has also appeared on recent slides, will be presenting Shaping the Future of Esports, comparing philosophies, labor, and infrastructure in collegiate programs, again on behalf of the Esports and Games Research Lab. Max, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to bringing up this topic. And I do think it builds off of the last talk quite nicely, especially given the overlap in personnel. I am presenting, in fact, on behalf of Andy and a few others that you might have seen if you were here for the last panel. We are all members of the Esports and Games Research Lab, which I co-direct with board member Amanda Cote. And lab is a consortium of scholars from across the United States, which studies college level gaming and esports. You can see a few of our articles in the lower right-hand corner. And if you're interested in finding out more about the lab, please feel free to go to eagerlab.org and .edu, and you can find out all about it. But I was trying to think of where to start with today's talk. And when I started thinking about it, I thought I might start off here, which is thinking about rehashing maybe unnecessary to rehash debate, which is about whether esports are sports or not. And I'm actually not going to dive into the debate. And there are many people here that have worked on sort of coming up with some common thoughts about that. I think we're probably all, especially at this conference, on the same page about the relationship between esports and sporting. Um, so I don't think we really need to dive into the nuances of the debate. But what I do think is important with this question, which seems to be ongoing depending on which institution you're talking to, um, is what that debate represents. In this case, it's the question of whether esports are sports highlights, in my mind, a disconnect between those from sporting and how they approach gaming. And of course, that disconnect pervades conversations of esports, whether considering something like Olympic inclusion or thinking about tournament structure. There are always these kind of ongoing needling issues of how, why, and in what ways sport will embrace esports and vice versa, frankly. And so, all this happens, as I actually spoke about at last year's ERN conference in London. This causes a lack of cohesion that comes when esports and different types of institutions interact. And, I would argue that universities and colleges are perhaps one of, if not the key representative sites where you can see this disconnect playing out. I'll go into this in more detail, but what's interesting is that a lack of cohesion, such a disconnect occurs across the world. Simply put, you can see tensions in university programs in esports in almost every country. Um, and at different levels, at different types of colleges and universities, they all are dealing with this question of esports and how to integrate them onto campuses and into curricula. And I would say that across these, what I want to focus on are what I think are three big issues that cause these disconnects. First, philosophies and program goals. Second, positions and labor. And third, infrastructure. So to get into each of these in a little bit more detail, first of all, these charts I think are meant to represent at least some of the ways that you can see how these tensions are meted out. And they're from a chapter that I led with quite a few people from ERN, including Seth Jenny, for the Routledge Handbook of Esports. And as you can see, there are different types of clubs and teams highlighted here at the collegiate level. But the reason that I show this is that they also highlight different philosophies and different motivations that come with programs. In fact, you dive into the literature, and many of the conversations, frankly, that I've heard over the last few days have been about different origins and motivations. Some programs start from the ground up, while others are motivated as explicit recruitment tools from the top down. Values represented can be very different, with some programs representing everything from supporting student life to training students in specific skills, and depending on country or context, actively competing or acting even as a subsidiary or another lower tier to the pros. As a consequence, student culture can actively seek inclusivity in their mission, or could be centered around instead fostering or recruiting specific cohorts of people and programs. And then finally, stakeholders can also look really different compared to their relationship to industry, et cetera. So what's clear is the diversity of program philosophies that exist under collegiate esports banners is very varied. Similarly, these organizational charts, which I was very happy to see being sort of recreated during the conference, show a few different ways of imagining the position within a university. And you can see that these can be complicated and they're often developed in ad hoc manners based on the needs of specific organizations. What's been clear from the lab's research is that significant levels of the labor within these charts are often placed on students and temporary workers rather than necessarily dedicated staff. And this also includes emerging roles like casters, which can be pushed onto student workers who theoretically know the technology and practices more than permanent staff. And I'm honestly worried that much of this stems from a desire for immediate gains and aspirational benefits to students, what one of my colleagues in the lab invokes under the banner of cruel optimism, that really shapes these decisions. The third major factor, which is often at tension within universities, stems from infrastructure and space. We've talked about that a little bit during the Q&A. As many who are academics here have probably experienced, the starter programs often comes with proposals for new facilities and fundraising. And sometimes this exists within larger facilities or programs like athletics, but other times it doesn't. And space and technology then are this constant concern, as well concern for thinking about how to maintain the growth of programs. And similar to what I've described, these necessary components are not necessarily considered or understood uniformly within colleges or universities. Instead, depending on the school, they can seem decidedly ad hoc. So once again, you have these real infrastructural hurdles that are difficult to overcome. So, to think about how these tensions inform how programs are developing in the state of collegiate esports overall, I took a look at the recent report led by ERN board member Seth Jenny, and I was really gratified to see the presentations yesterday. And I was mostly looking at the executive summary, so if Seth is in the chat, feel free to correct and go into more of the details as you like. But I wanted to look at those benefits and challenges that were mentioned from this report. And as you can see, some of the high-level benefits here are really philosophical, especially when you think about things like academics, inclusion, graduation rates, retention. These are all things that represent maybe different and even conflicting philosophies that are involved in the starting of programs. At the same time, the challenges are interesting. Some of them indeed are ideological, thinking about lack of inclusion, but I found those perceived program improvements around scholarships, competitive development, and marketing staff really interesting because they speak to, I would argue, labor and infrastructural issues. So to sort of put this simply, these three big components, philosophy, labor, and infrastructure, are really kind of needling and ongoing when it comes to thinking about the development of collegiate programs. They may even be stymieing long-term development. It's precisely the fact that these components are so diffuse and so often conflicting that make it difficult for there to be a cohesive understanding of where esports should be situated within colleges and universities. So we wanted to approach these issues through two research questions. The first of these was simply surrounding how the three main pillars are impacting program structures. Secondly, and given their prominence in the administrative process, we decided to also get the perspective of administrators when it came to these issues in terms of developing programs. And we took a multi-method approach to understand this. The first part was looking at what we are describing as a census of NACE schools. Interestingly enough, again, to refer back to the Voice report, There are some discrepancies between what we found and what the report found, so I'd be very happy to discuss those. I have some theories as to why we saw a difference. So we're still very much in the process of collecting this data from a list of programs that we started in 2024. We were collecting publicly available data, mostly from websites of the schools, on departments, games played, codes of conduct, administrative freedom, uh, rosters and teams, and program descriptions. And this gave us a kind of overview of how these programs look and enact philosophies, labor, and infrastructure. Then, to get a more nuanced understanding of how this is enacted, we supplemented our findings with the results of interview data from 37 stakeholders from across the country, which stems from a larger study looking at the institutionalization of collegiate esports more generally. So to briefly share our findings as they stand, first, and this really maybe fits with the philosophies, we found that in the US, there's no single type of school that is particularly dominant when it comes to hosting programs, though at least for our list, religious colleges were slightly more enrolled in NACE. We also found some consistency in games played. Most colleges really do focus on these top five, and I think that aligns with some of what we've seen throughout the conference. These points a bit more towards position and infrastructure. So it's interesting looking at this that athletics, at least according to our findings, made up a majority of where esports programs were housed, with student life coming in quite a bit lower. In terms of staffing, this was one of the really interesting things. Again, we were looking for listed staff members on websites, and we found usually just one listed staff member on a vast majority of the websites, with only one school listing 5 staff members. In terms of codes of conduct, most deferred to athletics in terms of how they presented their codes of conduct. And then, very unsurprising for probably everyone here, just in terms of media presence, majority of schools were promoting their work first and foremost on Twitch and second on Twitter or X, depending on what you are calling it. So now to get into some of the findings of our interviews, we got a little bit of more nuance into program decision making. And how these programs grew. So, for instance, we found out that many of those we interviewed had relative autonomy in their universities. This quote, for instance, highlights a common assumption that much of what was occurring in terms of infrastructure, investment and labor came from gaming clubs that eventually were formalized. So, start as a gaming club, work your way up. However, that position also led to organizational confusion, especially in regard to the university itself. For example, this interview from a research university in the Midwest explained that their program moved significantly as it grew, eventually being housed under a college and being monitored by an assistant dean rather than being where it originally was, which was located more in student life and in campus recreation. So obviously, as you might imagine, such a change would imply very different goals for the program, as it went from supporting student activities to something that would actually be associated with curriculum and broader education programming. We also saw from our interviews that there was an impression of significant ambivalence when it came to investment. One interviewee suggested that their research university funded very little. This was from a large research school with, either D1 or high division athletics. So it was very little. Their esports program, though, was funded very little compared to more well-known esports schools. It was completely student run, whereas other programs might have scholarships or facilities. And this led to frustration. You can see in the second interview here that that the interview discussed how an investment from an investment point of view, programs are flying blind, and the scariest part was launching them because the administration really didn't have a good sense of what needed to be brought into the program to find success. And just to be completely clear, this difference in investment and philosophy also extended to labor, and that many programs were run by students or had limited staff. And that translated also then into imbalances of infrastructure. So in this interview from someone located at a STEM-focused university in the Northeast, They discussed how larger schools might be able to invest in expensive esports arenas, a $200,000 esports arena. But if a school was relatively small, they would never be able to compete with larger programs. And as a consequence, that balance that would exist at an infrastructural level would ostensibly be there from conception onward when it came to what esports would look like at that school. In other words, and to put this very plainly, many of the imbalances that I introduced in the beginning of this talk seem to be quite persistent in how programs have existed for some time. Our interviews go back quite a few years. And what we did not find was a codification or uniformity beyond recognizing ongoing balances when it came to our interviewees. And so when it comes to some final discussion points, we can see those three pillars of concern are very present. Expanding a little bit further, when it comes to philosophy of programs, there still seems to be a lack of clarity and difference based on stakeholders, with some differences also existing between the administrators of programs and the broader administration of the university. This, of course, doesn't include interviews with tournament organizers or sponsors who would have a very different point of view, nor the students who we did interview, and we could discuss those more if you'd like. When it comes to labor, there's this consistent bottom-up approach, um, and this consistent bottom-up approach, and that means that staffing is often shorthanded and needs to be sold to broader administration and affiliated stakeholders for need. Uh, this is, of course, different than a lot of other components of universities where staff have long histories and are built into the program, and seems particularly stark when you compare it to, ball and stick sports of U.S. universities, especially if you think about large Division I universities, but even smaller colleges where there is a long entrenched staff. And then finally, infrastructure, while a potential point of pride and certainly something that is visible when it comes to launching a program as well as drawing sponsors, can be difficult to maintain. We saw that many of our administrators thought that such facilities were incredibly important for the future of their programs, but this doesn't change the reality that maintaining such spaces is often difficult. I'm looking at the time and I'm right on time. So as a final thought, I would, particularly in consideration of next steps, in terms of our research, we certainly are interested in conducting more interviews, which we plan to do in the upcoming months. And we also plan on expanding the census to which I just want to mention that we're always looking for partners. If you're interested in potential interviews or contributing to this database, this is something that is very much ongoing, and we are very interested in working with you. More broadly, and thinking about the themes of the conference, I would argue that thinking about these programs and how to sustain them into the future is difficult in collegiate esports because of imbalances and a lack of cohesion when it comes to the three pillars of philosophy, labor, and infrastructure that make up the core of developing programs at the university level. In other words, it's sort of the good and the bad. We think of this as a global, a global lab, that there's much room for experimentation, but without codification, some of that experimentation can cause pain points, particularly at the university level. I also think to some degree that these three pillars of concerns can be seen in the professional side of esports. We've seen the industry be shaken when philosophy, infrastructure, or labor seem to be mismatched with team or organizational prerogatives. You can see tournaments have to be restructured. You can see teams collapsing or going into financial ruin. So in some ways, I think this is an endemic problem that can extend out from just the university level. And then final thought, at least when considering universities, thinking about setting base standards in terms of labor and program vision at the onset and then letting those shape the size and investment programs seems key for their success and longevity, their future beyond the initial founding. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you to Amanda, Andy, Will, Bri, and Jeffrey. And I look forward to any and all questions and conversation.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Max. There are a couple questions and comments for you in the chat. So starting with a question, Seth says, how are you defining infrastructure in this instance in regards to collegiate esports programs? What is included in infrastructure?
That is a very good question, Seth. And I think that we've looked at it sort of on two angles or two vectors. The first is the technical infrastructure. So that would include, space, equipment, sort of the nuts and bolts of actually having a program exist on a material level. The second is infrastructural programmatically. So where the program sits within a university, how it is organized, etc. So those would be the two main places where I would say we are defining infrastructure. My guess, as far as it goes, is in terms of practical research, we're going to end up separating some of these out because obviously covering all that in one research topic is very difficult.
Seth also has a comment about the data discrepancies. He says, my guess is that some of the discrepancies are because you're collecting data from institution websites. Almost all university websites are not accurate, close, but not exactly. He says, for example, when looking at games offered, I pulled data from websites first, then asked directors, which didn't match exactly as they said the website was not updated. Then I asked players which games they played, which also didn't match exactly either. He says the red tape to update a university website takes forever, and universities usually don't give access to the people who need to make those updates. So do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, your guess was half of what I thought was for the discrepancy because I was really excited when I saw those differences being, and I started thinking it through. I completely agree that the websites are often updated haphazardly. That's why part of our census data collection is also looking at it over time. So we are actually marking when we look at websites and then returning to them to see how they've changed. I think there's some validity in keeping a close eye on those websites because they are often the public facing side of these programs. So, from a theoretical point of view, I think that's interesting. But I completely agree with you on that front. The other thought I had is we have restricted ourselves to NACE schools, which I know that your report did not. And so I think it would be really interesting to then, and maybe you have thoughts on this, compare sort of NACE schools and who's being recruited and what those programs look like versus some of the schools that are operating outside of NACE. Oh, and in terms of I can see Seth's question. Seth, sorry for those that for some reason might not see it. Seth is asking about what other discrepancies. The big one that I found was you had mentioned that there were much fewer programs within athletics than what we found. We found a majority of our programs were in athletics, and then you found and you had said I think yesterday that something like 25% were in athletics. So that was a really interesting discrepancy in my mind in terms of where the programs were housed. But maybe I actually misheard you. Yeah, yeah. And I guess that would be another factor. So maybe a majority of the varsity see themselves as athletic programs. That's a great point.
Sorry, just to read the statement out for
Sorry.
those who perhaps aren't seeing the chat. Seth contributed that NACE programs are all classified as varsity programs,
Yeah.
officially university-sponsored groups, whereas the Voice of Esports report included club programs, which might be more student-run or a little bit less official.
Yeah.
Any
So
other
those,
questions for Max? Sorry, Max, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, no.
Yeah, so Seth added, voice programs are not just varsity. They're likely to be in athletics when they are varsity. There's a question from Andy. Where are community colleges in this equation?
Seth might have some insights in terms of where they are in voice, because I believe those were also included. I don't think we had a vast majority of community colleges at all, and I think that would probably speak to how, just to add on to what Seth just said, the relationship between even having a varsity program at a community college versus not. My instinct is there are fewer varsity programs in community colleges.
Well, those are all the questions or comments I see right now. We've got a couple minutes left. Max, is there a final statement you want to make about this topic?
Just a call out to anyone who's listening now or later that, again, we are really looking to expand, particularly things like the census and our interview base. So please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on all social media at Maxwell Foxman because I'm the only one as far as I know. We would be very happy to try to think about potential opportunities for collaboration. And thanks again to all my co-authors.
Thank you so much, Max. We're going to take a quick break while we get our next speaker lined up. We'll be back in 5 minutes with our next presentation. See you all then.